Hello, world. All right, great. So SAS maps are not source maps. So if you're at the wrong talk, I'm sorry. Both of these were released in SAS 3.4. Both of these are SAS features that exist. Both came out in the SAS 3.3, which was, I think, done just for confusion. But source maps are for the browser, and SAS maps are a data type. They look something like this. Can you read that? The code, is that legible? Do I need to bump it up? Good? All right. So a map is a type of variable, parentheses, key value, another key, another value. It's a pretty simple thing, and we're going to spend 45 minutes talking about it somehow. So you've probably seen maps before. They exist in almost every language. They're also referred to as associative arrays or hashes or various other things. If you remember CSS, I don't know if any of you used CSS? It's an older thing. It's very similar to a map, just a slightly different syntax. You have a selector instead of the variable name, and you have property value instead of key and value, and then you're looking at brackets instead of parentheses, and commas here instead of semicolons at the end of a line. So a map can be exactly representative of CSS. So one of the quick things that we can do with it is we can just clean up some mundane repetitive things, say our colors. We can take a set of color variables and put them all together into a single namespace. So we have all of our colors in one map, one variable. And there's various uses to that, and we'll look at those. Another thing that you can do, sometimes arguments or sometimes mix-ins in SAS start to look like this. You get 30 arguments in a mix-in because it's a powerful mix-in. This is what Suzy would look like if we had built it without maps. But instead, we've cleaned it up to something like this, where you can pass the arguments in any order. And all of this was made possible by maps. So we're going to rush through and try to get to how we did this. But we're also what we're going to do, Suzy is big and complex. So instead, I made a button plugin that uses similar tricks. And we're going to make that today. So we're going to go through and make buttons because it's never been done before. Oh, this is a queer interlude. So whenever I make a mix-in or a plugin for SAS, one of the things that I do is try to remember that the web is queer, and developers are queer, and sites are queer. Everything is different. Everything has different requirements. So I'm not going to make you a framework that does it my way, because that's dumb. You don't want to build my site. So if we're going to make a button plugin, we're going to do it the queer way, and we're going to find a way that you can make your buttons. So that's the goal. These are the buttons I'm going to make, and having said that we're going to let you make your buttons, I stole these from Alex Wolf, roughly. But I tried to build a system for it that you can easily adapt and very quickly put your own styles into it. So in the end, it's going to look something like this. We'll have various options, and we can determine what these options are. I've decided to split it into style. Oh, I actually changed the name of this one later. Style, shape, display, color, icon, size, and then presets. And then I named some presets over here and said what I want them to look like. So that's how it's going to work. But first, we're going to just look at how you deal with maps. This is the simplest map. It's an empty map. It's just 2 parentheses. SAS will treat this either as a map or as a list, just the parentheses. Here's one with some keys and values in it, pretty simple. Here's 2 maps, And if we want to merge them, we just say, tonight is the merge of Map Magic with BlendConf, and we get this merged map. And you'll notice both of those maps have the hello key, and once we merge them, the second one takes precedence. So the key from BlendConf overrode the key from Map Magic. So, oh, the audience is no longer far away. So we should change that. We can edit the value in a map also using map merge because there is no map set. Some people have complained about this. I built a map set and it turns out to not save you any time or help in any way. So you can just use map merge. You can merge in a new map that has a similar key, and that's the same way you can override. So the audience is now smart and attractive. That's you. Lucky you. You can also add new pairs the same way because, again, there's no map set. So we can add month September to our map using map merge. There is a map remove, so if we need to take out key value pairs, we can do that. We just pass in the map and the key that we want removed. We can access pairs with map get. Just pass in the map and the key. And there's various other things we can do. We can get a list of all the keys. We can get a list of all the values. We can check to see if the map has a key. And then there's also some of the list functions that exist. If you look at the SAS website, you can play around. Some of the list functions work with maps and vice versa. So it's worth playing around and seeing what else works. But this is just kind of a quick overview of what exists. And then you can read maps like this. So this is a basic each loop from SAS. If you've ever used that, it loops through usually a list. And in a list, you would only get one value out of it for each iteration of the loop. With a map, whoops, where did I go? There we are. With a map, you get two values out. You get the key and the value, and you can use them like this. And we've printed out CSS that looks like our map. You can also use maps as arguments. I had to add this slide because somebody asked me about it the other day. You can pass in a map as an argument to a mixin, and then you can mess with it in there. You can also use variable arguments, which is adding those three dots. And then if your map keys match the argument names, it will just automatically fill them in. So that can also be useful. And really, you can do anything for a key and for a value. So you can have math as a key, and actually I found that map get omg stop 8 will match that math and return the value. You can also use lists. You can use a snowflake or any other little glyph you want. You can even use a map as a key to another map, and I dare you to find a use for that. I've tried. I can't find any good reason to do it, but it seems like fun, so you should definitely figure it out and let me know. Oh, I was going to get to buttons. Okay, so we'll do that now. So button components, I'm going to do this the yak shaving way because that's how I work. So we're going to start with icons, and then we're going to deal with colors, and basically we're going to build a plugin for each of these things because that's how I do. And so some of these, even if you don't want buttons, you might still want icons on your site. You might still want to use some of the color stuff. So hopefully the various pieces of this will be helpful to you, whatever you're doing, even if you don't care about my button plugin. So one of the things that I've often seen maps used for is cleaning up and working with font icons. This is sort of the basic. For a font icon, we need something like this. I'm just going to clean it up with a placeholder selector. So we have this available. That's code that will make our font icon work. And then you have some long list like this of all the glyphs and their names. But it's not very easy to read. It's not very easy to maintain. if you want to change a name, if you want to find something in the list, if you want to add to it. So I cleaned that up into a map where we just have the name of the icon and then the glyph that we're pointing to. If you've used font icons, this is how you access them. So then we can just run through a loop. If we want that same data icon output, we just run through a loop, and we extend that icon placeholder we had, and we, for each name and glyph, if data icon is that name, we get that glyph. And we've just output all of that repetitive code, but from a simple map that we can edit. Yeah? Oh, yes. So that should be icon to match those. Good catch. And please feel free to stop me and ask questions along the way. I'm going to kind of try to plow through this because there's a lot to go through. And there's a lot of code in here that I'm going to kind of skip through, and you can go back and look at it later. All the slides will be online because I'm going to try to hit concepts and just show you that we can do it. SAS is Turing complete. So anything you want to do with SAS, you can do with SAS. So you should try, right? You probably should try. So here's a little function to help us clean it up even a little bit more. The function just takes a name of an icon, does the map get, and returns the glyph. So then we add that. You can see the change in our loop. Instead of map get icon's name, we just call our function, and we get it back. Okay, so that's a little bit simpler. We can also build a mixin around it that does all the extra things, and then just call the mixin instead of putting before content and doing all that. We just have a mixin. And this way we can call our icons anywhere we want on the fly. Just say, oh, I want an icon here, and it gets added. So here's a sample of the data icon working. Span data icon check mark, and there it is. Or we can do it in SAS only. Title, include icon check mark, and it pulls it in. So both of those work. And we've got icons. Great. Oh, so let's do something a little bit more creative with it. Let's say we want to have new names referencing old glyphs in our map. We can do this. We have Escher referencing skull. We have Goodell referencing Escher. Bach references Goodell. And we've got Kevin Bacon at the end. And so now we can adjust our font icon function just a little bit. We add a little bit of recursion. So when we get an icon, we just check to see if that icon is another key in the map. And if it is, we call the same function again. So we just recursively call itself. And at the end, 6 degrees of icon, we call for Kevin Bacon, and we get the skull. So that's handy. We had in that function, where did we have it? Oh, it must have been in the mixin. We had in the mixin a content block, so we can also pass in arbitrary CSS that we want applied to our icon. So, great. We now have a font icon toolkit that we can use anywhere else we want, and we'll use it in our buttons later. Let's look at colors. Colors is going to be basically the same thing. We take our list of colors and we simplify them down into one map, so they're no longer taking up so much color or so much namespace. We don't have to prefix them all. They're just there. We use, here, we're going to try recursive colors. Now, this is a little bit more difficult because we get some errors. We can't adjust a color in the same map. We can't run this color adjust function, adjust hue, because this map doesn't exist yet at the time that we're calling the function. Does that make sense? right? So we can do the same recursion otherwise, but in order to do this, we have to find some other solution. So my solution, and I'm open to other solutions if people have ideas, my solution is this. I document what I want to change. So accent should be the brand color adjusted 180 degrees. And then later I have a color function that actually does the math. It goes and checks, and it runs the adjustment then once the map already exists, right? So that should work. So that color function looks like this. Just going through it, it starts by parsing the arguments, going through and getting the color, and then checking to see what is the base color, the first part of it, and what is the adjustments that we want. And having those, it does a recursive check on the base just to see if we need to follow down through farther. So it can do all of these adjustments recursively through as many connections as we want to make. And then it applies the adjustments at the end once it has its base color figured out and returns the color. So we've got it. It works. So I would say it's the one downside of moving your colors into a map, is this not being able to reference each other unless you have some special trick to do it. But it really does clean up the namespace. So that's my color plugin, and we use that at Oddbird. We use the icons at Oddbird. We use the colors at Oddbird. We do something very similar for sizes. Again, if you're dealing with something like a modular scale, your sizes might look something like this. I mean, we try to have consistent sizes across the site, just enough to do what we need. So you're maybe setting your base size and your ratio, and then calling some functions and setting all these. So again, we're just cleaning it up first, so there's that. But then I decided to add a named map of ratios so that I could call any ratio I wanted by name without having to think about what the actual math is behind it. So my ratio is now, instead of being 5/4, it's just major third. And that map does a great job of storing that information, and we can grab it all the same way. So now I'm down to just a base size, a named ratio, and my list of sizes. Again, we're going to have this problem. Oh, no, we don't have the problem here, because we can do a get size that just checks the map and returns a size, and we can do a get ratio that checks the ratio map and returns what the ratio should be, and then we can wrap all that in a size function that gets the size, checks to see if it's a unitless number, which means that we want it to be applied on the scale instead of passed through directly. So that means I can pass in a united number and it will just go directly through. So I can say size 1M and it just works. That's not really useful at this point because there's no math happening to it, but it could be useful later. If I do pass in just a 1 or a 2, it treats that as part of my modular scale and gets the ratio and does the math and returns my size. Great. Done. Any questions on any of those? So those are sort of the basics that we use all over the place. And then I'm going to start to get into how we actually build this keyword syntax. Does anybody have questions? All right. So let's deal with display. Let's say we want, just simply, we want to be able to say that our buttons should be block, inline block, or inline. Inline is not really going to be that useful, but block or inline block. Something like this. We'll want to include a button that's block. We'll want to include a button that's inline block. So our shorthand in the end is going to look something like this. A button can have an icon, a size, a color, display, shape, and preset. We're dealing with display right now, but we want to be able to have these shorthand keywords that we just pass in any order. And then once it comes in, we'll parse it. So we're going to need a parse function that can take something like this, large flat pill checkmark inline block, and turn it into a map. This is a really useful way of then storing the information of what was passed in sort of as individual arguments. So we start by making a map of just all the options. And this is how Susie does it as well. This is just all the options that can be passed into our mixin. So we start by, this is the setting that we want to change, and these are all the keywords that apply to that setting, right? So for display, we've got inline block or inline block. And then we have a parse function. This is really useful. I mean, we just have this one function that I use in all the plugins, and it just runs these loops. And if you've passed in a map, it just passes it back directly. So that means you can pass in a configuration map instead of the keywords if you want, if you like that system better. You just set up a few maps, pass them in, and you're ready to go. But if you do pass in the shorthand, it loops through it. Well, it loops through each item in the shorthand. If that item is a map, it just adds that entire map to your output. So you can even do a mix. You can do a few keywords and a map. If it's not a map, it checks for it in our options. And if it is in the options, then it adds it to the map for that option. So each keyword is just checked against the map of options and assigned to the right config. Is this making sense? I know this is very heady. So what we've got is this, a button mixin that just parses our input, and then all we have right now is display, so we just output it directly. Display, map get, style, display. So we're just checking the parsed map to see what our settings are. Cool. So let's deal with shapes. These are the three shapes that we're going to have. Yeah?
Sorry, what does the map get return when it doesn't have it? So like if you...
Yes. It returns null when it doesn't have the key. And we'll actually get to a place. Did the parser have this? No. Yeah, we'll get to a place where we actually use that to our benefit. The question was, what does map get return if it doesn't have a key? And it returns null. We're just going to make three shapes. So we add those to our button options. We have shape, round, square, and pill. And we just have to, we're going to make a button shape function that takes our shape argument and turns it into CSS. It's just picking a size here for the border radius, basically. And it returns that, and we can get border radius button shape of that input. So just adding one setting at a time to our buttons. Let's add styles too. We're going to play with these three styles. There's the flat button, the glowing button, and the outline button. And for these, this is where we really had to work in your own personal config. So you can create new style options very easily and quickly on the fly. But first, with our three, we have flat, glow, and outline as our keywords. And that's all it takes to add them to the parser. And then we're going to add here, let's get our color sizes and icons working while we're at it. So we added to our parser. It's dynamically checking our icons, colors, and size maps that we created earlier, and just adding all of those keywords that we created for icon, size, and colors. And those keywords are just automatically being added to our button options. And then we parse with that in mind and return our input. So now we have a little bit more complex mix-in. It's using our button parse so that it can check color, size, keyword, shape, color, size, icon, shape, and block or display. And we're going to create an output map instead of trying to output these all right away. We're going to create an output map that we then check here. This runs all the simple things, display and border radius in this case. And then what we do is we check for if a function exists. Have any of you used this before? It's also a fairly new feature in SAS. Function exists lets you check to see if the name that you're using is a function anywhere. So we've just said, all right, any style you pass in, we're going to check if there's button dash that style as a function. So if you want to create a new style, you just create a function for it and add it to the list of available styles. And then this checks to see if it exists, and if it exists, we call it. So this call function is the other piece of that says we can call something that we don't know the name of. And then we'll render the output, which, let's actually skip to rendering. So this is rendering. I use this function all the time. This just takes a map that looks like CSS and turns it into CSS. So we can create these output maps that are just CSS in map form, and we can do any manipulations we want. And then when we're done manipulating it, we just pass it to the render function, and it prints as CSS. So that's really handy for this. Here for button flat, I've created this map. It's just creating a background color, a contrasted foreground color. Oh, and it doesn't need that border radius. We already handled that. So I can do the same thing for button outline, button glow. They just do their own logic, create the CSS that they would want, and pass back that map of that CSS. And then we render it, and we can do something like this. So if our output map looks like that, has display and border radius, we render, and it's just the CSS version of that. All right. We actually want to deal with nested output for icons because we want our output map from icons has to have an extend of our icon placeholder. It has to have content, margin, and that all has to be nested inside of a parent selector and before. Something like this. Yeah, so this renders nested. Let's look at what it, yeah, and before, and then we have a nested map that we've created that comes in here that has the icon. So I have this in quotes because it gets confused by symbols and the colon there. So you just put it in quotes and it's a string, and we can use it for the output. So here's a beefed up render that just checks for each key value in the CSS map that we're looking at. If the type is another map, then we consider it a nested block, and we output it as a selector, and then whatever is inside, recursively calling the render function. So it can nest this as far as it needs to. If it's not, we check. We wanted a way to do extends in this, so we check for this special cased property, extend, and if it is an extend, we use extend instead of doing the property value pair. There we go. The only thing we can't do this for is mix-ins, which is one, you can't call an unknown name mix-in on the fly. So, but we can do it with extends. We can do it with selectors. Where are we? All right. So we've seen this. This is putting together the output, checking for the style output, and merging it in with that. So we could even override some of our basics in the specific of the style if we want to, just with map merge. So now we have this. We can do small, medium, and large. We can do different icons. We can do different shapes. And we can do glowing, flat, and outline. Cool. So now let's take that and make it so that we can have user defaults, system defaults, and a few presets that we name, and we just call the preset instead of passing in all of the arguments every time. Every time I build a system like this, I get complaints from Claudina that it's too powerful and people are going to do too many things on the fly. What we really need is a way to have named presets so that there's just 4 of them, and then we just always use those 4. So I built that in for Claudina. So Claudina's never seen this button thing before. I built it just for this because I like shaving yaks. But she'll tell me afterwards whether I did it right, and I'll make changes later. So for global defaults, I'm just going to do this, just a map of, for each setting, what is the default value that I want to use. And this will always be based on whatever I'm shipping the plugin, right? I've created 3 styles. You can create more, but for here, the default will be one of mine. And then I have a separate map for user config. So the user never looks at this map, never changes it. Instead of having a variable that is set to default that the user overrides, I have my variable that's all the system settings, and then I give you your own variable that you can do whatever you want with, where you create your override settings. And then instead of using map get, I use button get, which is my special way of saying we're going to check. I can pass in a map there if I want, but the default is just your user config. And I just say what setting I want to get. And first it checks the map you passed in. And if it returns null, you can just use this or, map get this. Or if there isn't anything, go on to the next one. And then it checks the user config settings. So first it's checking the local settings passed in, then it's checking the user config. And if it still doesn't have anything, it checks the system config. So in the end, we can go down through a list of as many of these as we want and return in order of the hierarchy wherever we find the value. All right. So let's name some presets. These are call to action, and then I have a submit, a secondary, an alert, and a whole list of social icons. So I'm going to name some presets like this using another map, because I map all the things. We have a submit, we have the call to action, we have secondary, alert, and social. And we just, within each one, we say what are the button settings that we want for that one. And we can even reference within the map. So secondary can reference submit and just make a few changes to it. Alert also references submit and makes a few changes. So we can do one basic setting and then adjustments from there as we want little changes. And we just change our button parser to be recursive here. If it finds a preset in what you passed in, it takes whatever other settings you passed in and checks the preset, builds the preset first, and then says, oh, you made these adjustments to it, so we'll add those adjustments to the preset. So it's just recursively checking back through the presets, building each one, and then adding your adjustments at the end. OMG. That's really, we've now built that, and you can add as many styles as you want. You can very easily add different shapes. And anytime you're adding anything to the parser, you just add it to the map of keywords and then add your own logic where you need it. And it all happens. Did we make it through? We made it through. We now have a button plugin. Are there any questions on that? Yeah.
You had a map of button options and then button defaults.
Yeah.
Did you build button defaults by looking through your options and grabbing the first items of each list?
I could. Yeah, you could do that. Right. So then whatever you set up in your button options, yeah, you could definitely do that. Did everybody hear that? That was, could you just loop through the first setting of each, or the first keyword in each setting, of your button options to create your button defaults, and you sure could. Anyone else? Yeah.
At what point in time, depending on the size of the project, you say this is too much work for a smaller project?
Well, it depends if you're me or if you're reasonable.
Do you use this process for everything that you do, or do you?
No, I use this process. Okay, so the question is, at what point is this too much work for a project? I really like playing with these things, so I do a lot of this on my own time just because I want to see what I can do with SAS. In terms of a specific project, it's usually, we're doing client work at Oddbird, so we're going from one project to the next often, and I start to build these if I see that we're doing the same thing over and over again across our projects, which is why I haven't really built a buttons one before. I mean, this might be useful to me, but buttons weren't my top priority. Colors, icons, and the smaller pieces I had built because they're fairly simple and they all use the same basic techniques. But it's a judgment call.
Second part of that, too, is with this adding things like cover state and active state, how much work goes into that?
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to add another, I was thinking of doing that, but I ran out of time. I was thinking I would just add a state or a tension, the hardest part of this is figuring out good names for all your settings and all your keywords. But yeah, just add a state key to the options map, add whatever states you want, and then in the button mix-in, you just have to look at that value and then do whatever logic you want for each output, add it to the output map, pass it to the renderer, and you've got what you need. So if you want states to use to be user configurable, you could do the same function call so that any user could add their own state, and then it would be, it could take you some work maybe, but it would be exactly the same things. You'd just be doing the same tricks we've already looked at to do that. Yeah.
I would just sort of extend your thought about when do you, like, hi. So that question of how, like, at what size of a project do you decide whether or not to make one of these things and to start building sort of your own toolkits and tools? I think it's really like you just start now and you build them for yourself. It's like your special set of tools, like carpenters and people that like to have their tool, their drill, right? And so maybe you don't have the time now because of constraints, but it's just something that you start having. And as Eric said, like, we build it and then we start using it and we keep refining it and it keeps coming with us, and it's things that we no longer have to create or think about doing, and it becomes ingrained in our process. So.
I guess one part of why I asked that too is, sorry, it's turning into a debate. Whenever I'm writing something, I'm always trying to keep in mind if ever I'm no longer in this position, who's going to take it from me?
Yeah.
At what point in time is this too complicated for somebody else coming in and having to learn this entire backlog?
Right. Well, the goal of my tools is that hopefully we can ignore most of this in our code. We just pull it in through a gem. We have our own toolkit at Oddbird. We just call it accoutrement, and we throw little things in there that aren't really big enough to become a plugin, but are useful tools that we have. And hopefully, if they're simple enough and explanatory enough in the interface of them. Sort of like Compass. You wouldn't want to go back into Compass and see how everything is done necessarily, but if it works and if it's fairly understandable how you use it, and you can look at the code and it makes sense in the use, then hopefully somebody taking over the project can do that without having to look back at where I was doing recursive loops.
I do think that's a wonderful
Yeah.
if you're handing this thing off to other people, or if like you're not the sole person on it, then taking into consideration the life.
It's a good reason to have a Claudina on your team who yells at you and says, Eric, that's a really dumb thing to do. Why are you wasting time on it? Can we just have basic colors? And then you say, no, and you make it anyway. So the last thing in here, we have our name presets. I wanted to just loop through the social buttons and create them. And actually, one of the cool things about the way we did this is that since it's checking each keyword and then checking each map, if we have keywords that are the same across multiple maps, we can call them with a single keyword. So if we set up colors and icons that are all named after these social sites, we just do the loop once, pass in that we want a social style button for a specific site, and it outputs, boom, there they are in the right colors with the right icons. So it's the downside of that is now we have these separated namespaces that we created are getting merged in this plugin, which can be a problem. But it's also potentially a feature. I just thought that was an interesting thing after I built it. It was interesting to do this with Suzy because when we started out, we knew we wanted to simplify and get some things. And we started doing it without maps, and then maps came out. We added maps, and we got 10 new features that we didn't expect just because we had implemented with maps, and suddenly everything was easier. So it's fun to play with creating things like this and then using them for a while and saying, oh, this actually does 3 more things than I thought it would do. So, thank you.